I am very confident that no one has told you how to learn gardening like I will today. And I'm even more confident that if you follow my #1 tip, you will change the world. So join me as I discuss the best ways to learn gardening. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I am a gardening educator. I can say that because of the many people who have been watching my gardening videos and the many people who have come to my public gardening classes over the years. Along the way, I've discovered some tips on how to learn gardening, and I want to share those with you today. I'm convinced that if you follow this process and follow that final tip at the end of this video, you will become a better gardener. Now, I admit this is a teaser video where I give you 5 tips, and you've got to watch all the way to the end to see that top tip. But I think each of these 5 steps is important. It's a process, and you really have to follow the whole process to fully learn gardening and fully appreciate what gardening is. So let's begin with number 5, which is really the first step in the process. And it may be pretty obvious. It's develop an interest in gardening. But I think that's important because you can try to learn something all you want, but if you're not interested in it, a lot of that knowledge isn't going to stick. Think about those subjects you had in school in the past. Those subjects that you really didn't like, you don't remember. Those subjects you did like, you probably remember the teacher, and you remember a lot of that information. Gardening is the same way. You have to have an interest to learn. I'll assume that you already have some interest in gardening, or you wouldn't have selected this video. But gardening encompasses a wide array of subjects, from rose gardening to herb gardening to espalier. And you don't have to know all of it. You just have to figure out which area of gardening is most interesting to you. I think that's one reason why so many gardeners get interested and then stop becoming gardeners, because there's just so much information out there and they really don't know where to begin. And so developing that interest is pretty simplistic and something you probably would have figured out on your own. But in this context of learning gardening, it really helps to specialize. It really helps to figure out what it is you're interested in. If you like vegetable gardening, then make that your interest. And you can totally forget the rose garden and the herb garden and the espalier. And so you have your interest, and you may be well ahead of me because you've had gardening interests for years. Well, number 4 is to acquire knowledge. And you're saying, duh, how else can we learn except to acquire knowledge? But I'm talking about specific knowledge, acquiring the knowledge about that topic that you have the interest in. I watch a lot of gardening videos, and I read gardening blogs and magazines and get as much information as I can. And a lot of it goes in one ear and out the other because it's entertainment for me. It isn't until I look at a specific topic for the purpose of learning that all of the key points begin to stick. So seek out the information sources in your interest area. If you want to learn about rose gardening, well then find your local rose society and become a member. You don't have to know about roses to be a member of the Rose Society, but you'll then surround yourself with experts in that field who will be more than glad to share the wisdom they've developed over the years. And you'll learn more about roses. If you don't want to put yourself out there and join a society or a club, well, you can accomplish very similar learning by getting a magazine that specializes in that particular subject, or following blogs or videos in a particular gardening subject. Whatever it is, acquire the knowledge. Now, I go into this in a little more depth in my video about becoming a master gardener, because I don't think everybody has to go through a formal master gardener course to really become a master gardener. They just need to figure out that specialization that makes them an expert in gardening. And then they're a true master. Well, that's what you can do by having your interest and then acquiring the knowledge. And then, step number 3, practice what you've been learning. The reason I'm using this garden bed as a backdrop for many of the shots today is because I'm taking my own advice. There are many things about growing perennials and grasses, and especially the roses, that I don't feel I know enough about. I've learned, I've acquired that knowledge, now I'm practicing it. I'm putting these plants in the ground to see how that knowledge really works. And though I would like all of this to grow and just really surpass my expectations, there's no guarantee that's going to happen. But I'm trying it. I'm practicing. And along the way, I continue to learn to see what works and what doesn't. The reason I'm standing in front of these lilacs is because I recently did a video on how to prune lilacs. Now, you can watch my video, you can watch other videos, you can read books, you can go to classes on how to prune lilacs, but until you get in there with your pruners and your loppers and your saw, it really doesn't necessarily make sense. You have to do it, you have to practice it, and I guarantee you, after you've done it once, you will have remembered all of those lessons that you read about or you watched videos on. So far you're probably thinking, there's nothing new here. I've already known all of these steps on what it takes to learn something. But I think my number 2 tip is probably going to surprise you a little bit. And so, the next step in this process is to teach gardening. I think the best way to learn gardening is to teach it to somebody else. And I can say that because I've taught a lot of gardening over the last decade in particular. And every single time I taught it, I learned something. And in many cases, I learned a lot. I'm using this compost bin system behind me as a backdrop because I recently built them for a video. And in that process, I learned about compost, the bacteria that does the whole process, and even about the pallets and how international stamps determine whether the wood can be good or bad for you to use. I'd encountered that information before, but until I put that video together to teach it, that information hadn't completely stuck. You've probably heard it. Those who can, do. Those who can't, teach. Now, it's often meant to be humorous. I find it completely false. It's a canard. It's a false, usually derogatory statement. In researching just that one sentence, I learned what a canard was. Now, that has nothing to do with gardening, but I've never used that word before. I will use it again. Just by teaching you this concept that teaching gardening is a great way to learn, I learned something that had nothing to do with gardening. Let's get back to gardening with that topic in mind. How when you teach something, you learn something. I've learned the most about gardening when I'm teaching about gardening. Years ago, when I was actively involved in the Master Gardener program and teaching classes regularly, the director of the program came to me and asked if I could teach a class on vertical gardening because they couldn't find anyone else to do it. And of course I said yes. But I knew almost nothing about vertical gardening. So I identified that as an area of interest. And then I acquired a huge amount of information before I put the class together. Talking to other master gardeners who had done it, watching videos, reading books, and in the little bit of time that I had, I even practiced some of the trellising techniques that I was going to teach for that class. By the time that class was over, the students commented on how wonderful it was and how much they'd learned. But what they didn't know was how much I learned, because I had to learn more than they learned so that I can teach it. I'm not saying that you have to become a master gardener and teach classes to really learn about gardening. I'm a bit of an extreme example. What I'm suggesting is that you just share that knowledge that you've acquired with someone who doesn't have the knowledge. Looking back at that rose society, when you don't know about roses and someone else shares their knowledge with you, well, for them to put it into words and explain what they know, it's been proven that as the brain processes all of that, it becomes more ingrained within the brain. They understand it better when they put it into words and explain it for someone else. That's what you can do. And it doesn't matter who you're explaining it to, who you're teaching. You could do a blog, and just by doing a blog to anonymous gardeners, you're teaching. You're explaining what you know, and you're reinforcing within your brain that information. Albert Einstein is credited with saying, if you can't explain it simply, then you don't understand it well enough. So as you teach, think about how you can express what you know in the simplest manner, and to practice that, and to really understand gardening and learn gardening. That brings us to our number one tip, and that's to teach gardening to a child. I started to get a little choked up as I finished that last sentence, because this subject means so much to me. I think getting children involved with gardening is the best thing that any gardener can do. And when you teach a child to garden, you get a whole new perspective about what gardening is, because they look at life differently. They have more honesty, more sincerity, and so you have to teach to that level. And that brings out the honesty and the sincerity about gardening from you. For about 5 years, I built a school garden at a local middle school. And I remember those stories in my video about the Galileo garden, which was an amazing garden. And during that entire time, I taught hundreds of youth about how to garden. When I started the project, I thought I knew a lot, and I did. But when I dealt with the youth, I realized how little I truly understood. I could do it. I could teach it. But until I had to teach a child that didn't understand some of the basic gardening terms and concepts, it wasn't until then that I truly appreciated what it means to know about gardening and what it takes to learn gardening to get to that point. Because they ask questions that you would never expect. And you've probably got experience with kids asking you things totally out of the blue. Many times it doesn't make sense, but at least it gets your brain thinking. For those questions that do make sense and that are about gardening, you realize it may be something you hadn't thought about before. And so now you're learning, truly learning internally about what it means to be a gardener and what it means to garden. You've probably noticed this shirt. It was a gift from my grandkids, and I'm wearing it to demonstrate that for me, teaching my grandkids how to garden is extremely important. You may have seen them in a couple of the videos that I've done with my two granddaughters in particular. The one on how to make seed tape was actually pretty easy. I had taught a lot of young people how to make seed tape. But when I taught a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old how to make seed tape, it really forced me to get down to the basics. What seed tape was all about and why we were doing it. And I'd kind of lost sight of that in all those years that I was making seed tape. Whatever it is, find a youth in your world that you can teach gardening to. Share the knowledge that you've acquired. Share those experiences that you learn from practicing. Teach someone, teach that youth about gardening. It will make you a better gardener. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, I think it will make the world a better place. It is pretty simple, and it's pretty basic. But I'm guessing you haven't seen anyone put together those steps as a process like I did in this video. I'd like to hear your comments about that process. What experience you have with developing those interests and acquiring that knowledge and then practicing what you've learned. Because most people get to those 3 steps and they've learned a lot. But how about the teaching? Have you taught gardening to somebody even within your family? And I'd love to hear the comments from you if you've taught gardening to youth, because I can pretty much guarantee everyone those comments are going to be very positive. If you like these videos and want to see more, well then subscribe to the Gardener Scott channel if you haven't already done so. And be sure to click on the bell so you know when new videos are coming out. If you like this video, you can give me a thumbs up and you can share it. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.